In this sense, we are thrown or projected into a world. So that human life starts at the very beginning as a cast of the dice. Its contingency is rooted in the very fact of the inescapable facts of your individual birth and parentage, your individual time and history. We're born in the 20th century and not in some other.
And what does Heidegger have to say about that?
Well, we begin our existence as a task in this sense, as something we take upon ourselves, because, you see, existence is not a neutral fact when you're concerned with human existence. Existence is ongoing. It has to be. We are always involved, thus, in the task of, as it were, creating ourselves. Always from this contingent,
moving
factual
into
basis.
an open future all the time.
Right.
Yes.
The future is the predominant tense in Heidegger. Because
he sees man as essentially a, so to speak, an ongoing creature. Yes.
And as a matter of fact, his account of we construct the notion of clock time. We make watches and other chronometers because we're planning to use our time. So we're projecting ourselves into the future, and on that basis, we can calculate time. So the dimension of time that is most compelling for him is the future, in the sense that the present has meaning only insofar as it opens toward a possible future.
You were saying just now that Heidegger, in his attempts to give an illuminating description of our actual everyday experience of life, is aware, you said, of the sudden holes in it.
Yes.
Well, what were you thinking? I mean, were you thinking of death?
Death,
what were you thinking
would
of?
be one case.
Yeah, what would be others?
Well, now, death, anxiety, he gives an analysis of conscience. But if we stop for a moment on death, I think that's because you asked me, how does this description give us something which we don't already know? And it's rather interesting that the description of death he gives is something which rather turns over our usual notions, because our usual notions try very much to escape from the fact of death. Now, this is something very peculiar about death. We usually think of death as a fact in the world. We read about people dying, we read obituaries and so on. It happens to other people. To be sure, it'll happen to me, but not yet. So it's something out there in the world, as yet external to me. But the peculiar thing is, if I start to think of it as my death, now, my death will never be a fact in the world for me. I will never read my obituary, which is, I think, a very significant little fact. So it can never be a public event in the world for me.
Well, as Wittgenstein says, death is not an experience in life because we don't live to experience death. It's not something we live through, and therefore not an experience we have.
Yes, it's not, unless my death is as essentially mine is something which cannot be an event in the world for me, but it's a compelling possibility for me now. I mean, the meaning of death is that it is a present possibility. I may not be at any time. The meaning of death is that it's the possibility of not being, or it's, as he puts it, it's the possibility which cancels all my possibilities. Now, in this sense, it's the most extreme of possibilities, but his point is, once you realize that this particular possibility inhabits your existence, it's sort of the warp and woof of it in some way, that you can either collapse and scurry away from it in fear, or you can face up to it, and then you ask yourself the question, there is that possibility. In the face of that possibility, what meaning does my life have? See, I think for Heidegger, he would agree with Tolstoy that the fundamental, or at least at this stage of Heidegger's thinking, he would agree with Tolstoy that the fundamental question that the philosopher, as well as every man, has to put is this: since there is death, what meaning does my life have? And that, I think, is where suddenly, if you think of death as this interior possibility, it takes on a new dimension from what it ordinarily carries. You see, when we refer to so-and-so died and so-and-so died and so on.
I must say again, this is something that I find deeply congenial. Although I was trained in philosophy in an entirely different tradition from this, everything you're saying makes very much sense to me.
Yeah.
I've very strongly this feeling, and I suppose large numbers of people must have it, that our everyday life is at one and the same time sort of banal and over-familiar and platitudinous, and yet at the same time mysterious and extraordinary. I have that double feeling about life, and I certainly have very strongly the feeling that in the face of death one wants to seek some meaning in one's existence. Now, having reached this point, does Heidegger call in aid a traditional religious explanation of existence, or what does he do?
No, he has no answer. All he's pointing out is the structure of human existence, or the framework within which one has to pose these questions. He's showing that this is a dimension of human existence which has to be faced. What answer you give to the question, what meaning do I have, will depend upon the particular individual. I mean, Heidegger has no ethics in this sense.
The one feature of human life which he does draw a great deal of attention to, in addition to this, what you called Geworfenheit, the fact that we are flung into it and find ourselves in the middle of it, is the finitude of it, isn't it? I mean, not only do we just kind of wake up in the world and find ourselves here, but the whole situation lasts a very short time. I mean, we've scarcely got used to finding ourselves here, then it all stops again. And the fact that it all stops again is, for most human beings, as you were just saying, very frightening and very alarming. How does he recommend that we proceed from there?
No recipes. The point is, he points out that whatever decision you take to give your life meaning or to encounter death, it is the human condition that must be faced in one form or another. And perhaps, I mean, he doesn't say this, but there's a suggestion of Tolstoy and others that perhaps all philosophy is a response to this question of death. Socrates remarked that all philosophy is a meditation on death, which we might interpret liberally in this fashion, that man wouldn't philosophize if he didn't have to face the fact of death. If we were all Adam living eternally in the Garden of Eden, we just saunter along and ruminate about this or that, but not any serious philosophical issue.
One thing that Heidegger and the existentialists face, which I think previous philosophers didn't face, is the fact that our knowledge of death induces anxiety. It's terrifying. We're frightened when we try to look in the eye the fact that we are going to die. And so anxiety in the face of our own finitude or mortality becomes one of the central themes of existentialist philosophy, doesn't it?
And I think it's important to see that this places what I consider fundamentally a sound and healthy assessment on the fact of anxiety. Anxiety is sort of led a checkered career in modern culture. I mean, it became fashionable a few decades ago. I remember when Auden wrote his book, The Age of Anxiety. Well, it seemed to be the thing that was fashionable. It was the in thing. People went around cultivating their anxieties and so on, which is rather silly, because if we've followed our previous description of death, we realize that anxiety is there anyway. As a matter of fact, anxiety is simply our human existence in its contingency coming to the level of consciousness. It is the sheer contingency of human existence sort of vibrating there through us. On the other hand, you see the other modern attitude, which is partly the result of our being a technical society which commands certain instruments. We have a command of drugs or remedies of various kinds. We imagine that there should be some instrument or means by which we can simply press a button and get rid of our anxieties, that they're not something which have to be faced and lived through. And I think either extreme is rather unfortunate. It is simply part of the condition of being human. And in a certain sense, at one point, Heidegger says, well, there are all sorts of modes of anxiety, and in some forms it has the kind of peacefulness of a creative yearning. If we weren't anxious, we would never create anything.
But man's attempt to evade, to, so to speak, run away from his own anxiety, to evade the reality of his own mortality, leads, doesn't it, to the next existentialist theme, namely alienation, that we avert our eyes from the stark reality of our own existence and, in a sense, cease to participate in the realities of our own existence. Now, this is something that existentialist philosophers have a great deal to say about too, and another term like the term anxiety, which has become much misused by sort of fashionable and trendy writers. Yes. Would you agree with that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, alienation is unfortunately one of the terms that's been tossed around so that if the word is used, people will say, oh, that boring subject, you see, because but it does happen, nevertheless, to be one of the deepest themes of modern culture. And it preoccupied Hegel, Marx, and I think it's been a main item in contemporary literature of the 20th century. Now, Heidegger's point, you see, perfectly validated. The mere fact that we have a civilization which has a great deal of means of information at its disposal, so people know what's in or what's out, what's going. So the word alienation is tossed around. And the mere fact that we make it into an empty banality, in a sense, promotes our alienation. It's one of the causes.
I mean, one way of escaping anxiety is not to take it seriously, to make it frivolous or trendy or... Yes.
Well, he's alienated, so what?
Yeah.
But see, alienation occurs for Heidegger on several levels. One is this level in which we may lose ourselves in the impersonal social self. A man buries himself in his persona, his social role, and so on. As a matter of fact, Sartre took that from him and developed it really
like
very
melodramatic. The Wordsworth poem, "The world is too much with us, late
indeed.
And soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers," etc.
But you see, alienation is really quite a real problem. In this sense, I must say, I have a feeling of very acutely for the moment. I'm putting this slightly humorously, but I think you will understand this. Here I descended from the skies into London, and I haven't quite found myself, and it seems rather strange. See, alienation
You feel slightly detached from reality.
And as I walk the streets, these are strange people in certain ways.
Yeah.
A couple of more days, and I probably feel at home.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, the word alienation, of course, means something
we all feel like that in strange cities, but some people feel like that in the world, don't they?
Yes,
permanently.
they inhabit their own skins as strangers.
Yeah. Now, I want to move on. We've been talking so far about the basic themes of being and time, and I think it will strike people listening to this discussion straight away that this is a book which deals with very fundamental themes which do exercise people at a very deep level. And even if there are no answers, I think the fact that it illuminates the questions, which it certainly does, or at least it certainly has for me, is in itself something of enormous value. But like so many other philosophers, having worked out a big philosophy young, he then moved on and in some sense away, didn't he, from his early concerns. For example, Being and Time is the first, or it's presented as being the first volume of what is to be a 2-volume work. But the second volume never came out. So all we ever have is this first half of a book. Why didn't he finish that initial program? And why did he then go on to do unexpected and unforeseen things?
This is the subject of both discussion and speculation. It turns out from recent information I've had just a month or so ago in the United States that Heidegger has left the manuscript of the second part, which he himself...
So it does exist and it will be published?
I don't know. It'll be published as a kind of a nachlass of something he's left behind, but I don't think it was publishable. I myself tend to think that I know what he was going to say in that, and he said it in his book on Kant and a few essays since. But then there occurs this thing which is the Heideggerian scholars call the Kehre, the turn. He felt in some sense that in Being and Time, he had riveted his attention too exclusively on man, and that this philosophy was a powerful form of humanism, but there was no systematic grasp of what the human being is rooted in, and of course
the world of nature, you mean, the material world,
the cosmos.
The cosmos.
In a sense,
yes.
You see, in a sense, Heidegger, I would say, is a follower of Parmenides. You see, this Greek sage who had this electrifying idea of, you see, the all is one. For the first time in human history, the notion of the totality of being as one thing, you see, to which we have to relate ourselves in our thinking. And Heidegger's written about Parmenides, but now in this sense, he feels that precisely what has happened with modern culture is we've lost those cosmic roots in a way, that we've been detached from the sense of our connection with the whole or the all.